Marcus Blackwell's hand cracked across the nurse's face so hard her head snapped sideways, and blood sprayed from her lip onto the white hospital wall. She hit the floor. 61 years old, 30 years of nursing, and she was on her knees in front of the man who ran this hospital, shaking, bleeding, while 23 people watched and did nothing. Marcus looked down at her the way you'd look at something stuck to your shoe. "Get up," he said, "and clean that wall." He walked away. Nobody helped her. Nobody even moved. That was a Tuesday. Marcus Blackwell had hit 14 nurses and never once been touched back. By Friday, a quiet new nurse named Elena Vasquez would change that in exactly 1.8 seconds. Before we get there, subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the very end. Comment your city so I can see how far this story reaches. The first time Marcus Blackwell hit someone at Crestwood Regional Medical Center, he did it in front of 9 people. 9. And not one of them reported it. Her name was Danielle Porter. She was 26 years old, 2 years into her nursing career, and she loved her job more than anything in the world. She'd wanted to be a nurse since she was 11, since the night her grandmother had a heart attack at Thanksgiving dinner, and the paramedics arrived, and one of them, a woman with calm hands and a steady voice, had looked at little Danielle and said, "She's going to be okay, sweetheart. I've got her." Danielle never forgot that woman. She never forgot how it felt to watch someone take control of chaos. And she spent the next 15 years working toward the moment she could be that person for someone else. She graduated top of her class. She got hired at Crestwood, one of the most respected hospitals in Charlotte, North Carolina. Her first year was everything she dreamed of. She was good at her job. She was making a difference. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Then Marcus Blackwell became CEO. Danielle didn't know what was coming. None of them did. Marcus arrived with a reputation for turning struggling hospitals into profitable ones. And for the first 3 months, that's exactly what he seemed to be doing. New systems, new protocols, budget restructuring. The board loved him. The press loved him. He gave interviews where he talked about patient-centered excellence and empowering healthcare teams. Behind closed doors, Marcus was building something else entirely. It started with his voice. Marcus had a way of speaking to people that stripped them down to nothing. Not yelling, not at first. It was worse than yelling. It was quiet, controlled, surgical. He would stand 2 inches from your face, lower his voice to almost a whisper, and say things designed to make you feel like the smallest person in the room. He told Dr. Alan Griffith, a cardiologist with 20 years of experience, that he had the clinical judgment of a first-year student in front of his entire department. Dr. Griffith stood there, face burning, while 30 colleagues pretended to study their shoes. He told a nursing supervisor named Brenda Collins that she was the reason patients die in this hospital. Brenda had worked in healthcare for 31 years. She went home that night and cried for 3 hours. She told her husband she was thinking about early retirement. Her husband asked why. She couldn't bring herself to explain. Within 6 months, Marcus had created a system so effective that no dictator could have designed it better. Everyone watched everyone. Everyone was afraid of everyone. Because Marcus didn't just punish the person who made a mistake. He punished everyone around them. When a phlebotomist named Ray accidentally mislabeled a blood sample, Marcus didn't just fire Ray. He called a meeting of the entire laboratory department, stood at the front of the room, and spent 45 minutes describing in detail how Ray's incompetence could have killed a patient. Then he looked around the room and said, "Every single one of you is responsible for this. Every single one of you failed. And if it happens again, I won't just fire one person. I'll fire the whole department and start over." Ray cleaned out his locker that afternoon. Nobody said goodbye to him. Nobody even looked at him. Because standing next to the person Marcus was destroying felt like standing next to someone who'd been struck by lightning. You didn't want to be close enough to catch the next bolt. That was how Marcus operated. He didn't need to be everywhere. He just needed people to believe he could be anywhere. And they did. God, they did. Nurses started whispering in the hallways. Not about patients, not about treatment plans, but about Marcus. Where was he? What floor was he on? Who had he spoken to today? His name became a kind of weather system that everyone tracked constantly. Marcus is in the East Wing. Marcus just came out of a meeting. He looks angry. Marcus is heading toward the ER. Warn them. People adjusted their entire days around his movements. They took longer routes to avoid passing his office. They timed their breaks to make sure they weren't in the cafeteria when he was. A respiratory therapist named Miguel told his wife one night that going to work felt like going to prison. She thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. Then came the slapping. The first time it was Danielle. The meeting with the donors was happening in conference room B on the 3rd floor. Danielle didn't know about the meeting. Nobody had told her. She needed a signature from the charge nurse on a medication order, and someone said the charge nurse had gone to the 3rd floor. Danielle knocked on the conference room door. When nobody answered, she opened it. Marcus was mid-sentence, gesturing toward a PowerPoint slide surrounded by 4 donors in expensive suits. He stopped. He looked at Danielle, and something crossed his face that Danielle would later describe as the most frightening thing she'd ever seen. Not anger, something colder, something that looked almost like pleasure. He excused himself from the donors. He walked to the doorway where Danielle was standing, already apologizing, already backing away, already saying she was sorry. She didn't know. She didn't mean to interrupt. Marcus grabbed her arm. He pulled her into the hallway, and he slapped her across the face. The sound was sharp and loud. It echoed off the linoleum. 9 people were in that hallway. 2 nurses, a lab technician, a transport aide, a medical student, and 4 visitors waiting for a family member. Every single one of them saw it. Danielle's hand went to her cheek. Her eyes were wide, not with pain but with disbelief. This couldn't be happening. This was a hospital. This was her workplace. This was the CEO. Marcus leaned in close. His voice was that same terrible whisper. "If you ever interrupt me again," he said, "you won't just lose your job, you'll lose your career. Do you understand me?" Danielle nodded. She was shaking. Marcus straightened his tie, turned around, and walked back into the conference room. He closed the door. Through the glass panel, the donors could see him, smiling and gesturing and continuing his presentation as if nothing had happened. Danielle stood in that hallway for 2 full minutes before her legs started working again. She walked to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and pressed her forehead against the cold metal door. She didn't cry. She was too shocked to cry. Her brain was still trying to process what had just happened. A nurse named Grace found her 20 minutes later. Grace had been at Crestwood for 5 years at that point. She was 47 years old, experienced, competent, and she'd been watching Marcus Blackwell very carefully since the day he arrived. Grace sat down on the bathroom floor next to Danielle and said, "I saw what happened." Danielle looked at her. "Then help me report it." Grace was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that Danielle would never forget. "Honey, I want to. I really do. But if you report this, he'll destroy you. And everyone who backs you up." "There were 9 witnesses," Danielle said. "There were 9 people who are afraid of losing their jobs," Grace said. "That's not the same thing." Danielle filed the complaint anyway. She walked into HR the next morning with her written account, and she named every person she could remember seeing in that hallway. HR opened an investigation. They called it a thorough and impartial review. It lasted 4 days. Marcus's version was simple. Danielle had been insubordinate and hysterical. He'd raised his voice, perhaps, but he'd never touched her. The donors backed his story. They said they hadn't seen anything because they'd been in the conference room with the door closed. Of the 9 people in the hallway, 7 said they couldn't clearly recall what happened. The medical student said he'd been looking at his phone. The transport aide said it happened too fast to see clearly. Only one person corroborated Danielle's account. a nurse named Tom. Tom said he'd seen Marcus grab Danielle's arm and strike her face. He provided a written statement. 3 days later, Tom was transferred to the night shift at the hospital's smallest satellite facility, 40 minutes from his home. His schedule was changed so that he worked every weekend. Within 2 months, Tom resigned. Danielle was offered a settlement, $15,000 in a non-disclosure agreement. Her union representative told her to take it. Her mother told her to take it. Even Grace, who'd found her in the bathroom, told her to take it. "Fight him and he'll bury you," Grace said. "Take the money and get out while you still can." Danielle took it. She signed the NDA. She left Crestwood. 6 months later, she left nursing entirely. She now works as an office manager at a real estate firm in Raleigh. She's good at her job. She's fine. But sometimes when she hears a door slam unexpectedly, her hand goes to her cheek. She doesn't even realize she's doing it. After Danielle, Marcus knew he could do anything, and he did. The second nurse he hit was a woman named Priya, who'd questioned a new discharge protocol that she felt was unsafe for elderly patients. Marcus called her into his office, closed the door, and slapped her twice, once on each cheek. Then he told her that if she ever questioned his decisions again, he'd make sure she never worked in North Carolina again. Priya went home and told her husband. Her husband wanted to call the police. Priya begged him not to. She said Marcus would find out. She said it would make things worse. Her husband asked how things could possibly be worse than her boss hitting her. Priya couldn't answer that question. She just said, "You don't understand what it's like in there." She was right. Nobody understood what it was like unless they'd lived it. The third was a charge nurse named David. Marcus hit David because David had paged him during a board dinner. The patient was coding. David needed authorization for an emergency procedure. He paged the CEO because the attending physician was unreachable, and the protocol required executive sign-off for that specific intervention. David was doing his job. He was trying to save a life. Marcus slapped him in the stairwell the next morning and told him, "You embarrassed me in front of people who matter." The patient David had been trying to save died 2 days later. David never talked about it. He just stopped volunteering for extra shifts. He stopped mentoring new nurses. He came in, did the minimum, and left. The light went out of him so gradually that most people didn't notice until it was already gone. By year 3, Marcus had struck 8 nurses. By year 4, 11. By the time Elena Vasquez's application arrived at Crestwood, the number was 14. 14 people who'd been physically assaulted by their CEO. 53 who'd been subjected to verbal abuse severe enough to cause documented psychological harm. Over 100 who'd simply left rather than endure another day. And the board knew. They knew because 3 separate formal complaints had reached them. They knew because the turnover data was impossible to ignore. They knew because the hospital's own attorneys had quietly warned them about liability exposure. But Marcus made them money, and money, in the end, was the only language that boardroom understood. Grace watched all of it. For 8 years she watched. She watched Marcus destroy good people. She watched talented nurses pack their things and leave. She watched the hospital she'd once loved become a place where kindness was a liability and silence was the only safe strategy. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she had a mortgage and a son in college, and she couldn't afford to be a hero. She told herself that keeping her head down was the responsible thing to do. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, Grace knew the truth. She was afraid. She was as afraid as everyone else. And her silence, like everyone else's, was what kept Marcus Blackwell in power. One night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Grace whispered something to herself that she'd never said out loud before. Someone needs to stop him. Then she turned over, pulled the blanket up, and tried to sleep. Because in the morning, she'd go back to Crestwood, and she'd keep her eyes down, and she'd survive another day. She didn't know that someone was already coming. Elena Vasquez's application was processed on a Thursday. HR flagged it as high priority because the position had been vacant for 4 months and they were desperate. The hiring manager reviewed Elena's credentials and picked up the phone immediately. "Miss Vasquez, this is Rebecca at Crestwood Regional. We'd like to schedule an interview at your earliest convenience." "How about Monday?" Elena said. "Monday works perfectly." Elena hung up the phone. She sat in her small apartment in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and looked at the photograph on her bedside table. Her mother, Maria, smiling in a hospital bed 3 years ago, her body ravaged by cancer, but her eyes still fierce, still full of the fire that had defined her entire life. Maria Vasquez had been a fighter, not in the physical sense, though she was tough enough. She fought with words, with conviction, with an absolute refusal to accept cruelty as normal. She'd raised Elena alone after Elena's father died in a construction accident when Elena was 7. She'd worked 2 jobs. She'd made sure Elena had everything she needed. And she'd taught her daughter one thing above all else. "You never walk past someone being hurt," Maria told Elena when she was 10 years old. They'd been watching the news, a story about a man who'd been beaten on a subway while other passengers looked away. "You hear me, mija? Never. You stop. You help. You be the person everyone else is too afraid to be." Elena carried those words through her entire life. Through 8 years in the Marine Corps, where she deployed to combat zones and learned to protect people under fire. Through nursing school, where she discovered she could save lives with medicine the way she'd once protected them with her training. Through a decade of clinical work, where she'd seen the best and worst of healthcare. And now she carried those words to Charlotte, North Carolina. Because 3 years ago, when Maria was dying, she'd shared a hospital room with a woman named Karen Mitchell. Karen had been a nurse at Crestwood for 6 years before Marcus Blackwell broke her. She'd left healthcare entirely after he'd slapped her in front of patients. She'd been in the hospital for treatment of severe anxiety and depression, conditions that her therapist directly attributed to workplace trauma. Karen and Maria talked for hours during those long hospital nights. Karen told Maria everything about Marcus, about the fear, about the good nurses who'd been destroyed, about the system that protected him and punished them. Maria listened to every word. And then, 3 weeks before she died, she took Elena's hand and said, "There are people in that hospital who need someone like you. Promise me." Elena promised. She spent the next 2 years preparing. She reviewed her combat training. She studied workplace harassment law. She researched Crestwood's board structure, its complaint history, its legal vulnerabilities. She obtained records through public information requests. She talked to former employees. She built a picture of exactly what she was walking into, and then she applied for the job. Now she sat in her apartment, looking at her mother's photograph and said, "I'm going, Mama. I promised." She started packing that night. On the Monday she was scheduled to interview, Elena wore a simple navy blue outfit and arrived 15 minutes early. The HR coordinator, a young woman named Ashley, seemed nervous and rushed, the kind of low-level anxiety that Elena recognized immediately as institutional, not personal stress, organizational fear. "Welcome to Crestwood," Ashley said, smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're excited to have you interview with us." "Thank you," Elena said. "I'm excited to be here." During the interview, Elena answered every question perfectly, not because she was performing, but because she was genuinely skilled. When they asked about her approach to patient care, she talked about compassion and attention to detail. When they asked about conflict resolution, she talked about communication and de-escalation. When they asked why she wanted to work at Crestwood specifically, she said, "I believe this hospital has the potential to be something special. I want to be part of that." The hiring manager offered her the position on the spot. Elena accepted with a warm smile. She shook hands. She thanked everyone. And as she walked out of the building, she paused at the entrance and looked up at the Crestwood Regional Medical Center sign. She thought about the 14 nurses Marcus had struck. She thought about the 53 he'd verbally destroyed. She thought about Danielle Porter selling real estate in Raleigh, flinching when doors slammed. She thought about Karen Mitchell in a hospital bed, broken by a man who'd never faced a single consequence. She thought about her mother's hand, thin and fragile, gripping hers with surprising strength. "Promise me." Elena's jaw tightened. She was 3 days away from her first shift, 5 days away from meeting Grace, 8 days from putting Marcus Blackwell on the floor of the emergency department. But that was still to come. For now, Elena Vasquez got in her car, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and took one long, steady breath. Then she drove to her new apartment to unpack. She had work to do. Elena Vasquez started her first shift at Crestwood Regional Medical Center on a Monday morning at 6:45, 15 minutes before she was required to be there. She walked through the main entrance carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder, her badge clipped to her scrub top, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She smiled at the security guard. She said, "Good morning." The guard looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. Nobody said good morning at Crestwood. Not anymore. The fourth-floor medical surgical unit was already buzzing with the controlled chaos of shift change. Nurses huddled at the station, passing along patient updates in clipped, efficient sentences. Elena stood to the side, waiting for the unit manager to finish a phone call. She watched, she listened, and what she heard told her more than any orientation packet ever could. Every voice was low, every sentence was careful. 2 nurses at the end of the hallway stopped their conversation the moment they saw someone round the corner. A physician signing orders kept glancing toward the elevator like he was expecting a predator to step off it. This wasn't a hospital. This was a building full of people trying not to be noticed. The unit manager, a woman named Janet, hung up the phone and turned to Elena with a smile that was professional but hollow. "You must be Elena. Welcome to Crestwood. Let's get you started." Janet walked her through the floor, pointing out supply rooms, medication stations, the break room. She explained shift protocols, charting systems, patient assignment rotations. She was thorough and organized, and spoke at a pace that suggested she wanted to get through this as quickly as possible. When they passed a closed door on the administrative wing, Janet lowered her voice without seeming to realize she'd done it. "That's the executive offices. The CEO is very hands-on. He has high expectations. You'll want to make sure your documentation is always current and your response times are within standard." Elena nodded. "Of course. He does rounds regularly. If you see him on the floor, just be professional. Do your job. You'll be fine." Elena looked at Janet carefully. "Has there ever been a problem with the CEO and nursing staff?" Janet's face went blank. Not calm, not neutral, blank. The kind of blank that takes practice. "Mr. Blackwell expects excellence, that's all." Elena didn't push. She didn't need to. Janet's face had already told her everything. By 10 o'clock, Elena had received her patient assignments, reviewed charts, started her medication rounds, and introduced herself to 6 patients on the floor. She worked with quiet efficiency. Her hands were steady. Her assessments were sharp. When she found a discrepancy in a patient's fluid intake log, she flagged it immediately and contacted the physician. When an elderly man with dementia became agitated during a blood draw, Elena took his hand, spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, and talked him through it without needing to call for assistance. The other nurses noticed. "She's good," one of them whispered to Grace at the nurses' station. Grace looked up from her charting and watched Elena walk down the hallway with a stack of fresh linens. "Yeah," Grace said, "she seems it. Think she'll last?" Grace didn't answer. She'd seen a lot of good nurses come through those doors. None of them lasted. Not because they weren't skilled, because Crestwood ate people alive. The first warning came during lunch. Elena was sitting alone in the break room, eating a turkey sandwich and reviewing a patient's lab results on her tablet, when Grace walked in and sat down across from her. Grace didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds. She just sat there, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, staring at the table. "You seem like a nice person," Grace finally said. Elena looked up. "Thank you. I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." Elena put down her sandwich. She gave Grace her full attention, the way she gave every patient her full attention. Steady eyes, open posture, complete presence. Grace took a breath. "Marcus Blackwell is not what they told you in orientation. He's not just demanding. He's not just strict. He's dangerous, Elena. Physically dangerous." "What do you mean?" Grace's eyes darted to the break room door. She lowered her voice to barely a whisper. "He hits people, nurses. He slapped nurses on this floor, in the ER, in the stairwells. I've seen it with my own eyes. I watched him hit a woman named Priya so hard she stumbled into a wall, and nobody did a damn thing, including me." Grace's voice cracked on that last sentence. She pressed her lips together and looked away. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many?" "How many what?" "How many nurses has he hit?" Grace shook her head. 14 that I know of, probably more. Some people don't talk about it. Some people left before anyone found out." "And the board?" "The board counts money. That's all the board does. Marcus makes them rich, and they look the other way." Grace leaned forward. "Listen to me. The best thing you can do is stay off his radar. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak up in meetings. Don't question anything, even if you know it's wrong. Just do your job, keep your head down, and go home in one piece. That's how you survive here." Elena studied Grace's face. She saw the exhaustion there, not physical exhaustion, but the deep, bone-level weariness of someone who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. She saw the shame. Grace knew that staying silent was wrong. She'd known it for 8 years. But knowing something is wrong and having the power to change it are two very different things. "I appreciate you telling me this, Grace," Elena said. "I really do. Just be careful, please." He destroyed the last nurse who stood up to him. A woman named Danielle. She filed a complaint and he erased her, made every witness disappear. She ended up signing a gag order and leaving healthcare for good. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What happened to the witnesses?" "One of them backed Danielle up, a nurse named Tom. Marcus transferred him to the worst shift at the worst facility until he quit. The rest suddenly couldn't remember what they saw. Fear does that. Makes your memory real selective." Elena picked up her sandwich and took a bite. She chewed slowly, thoughtfully, as if she were processing a complex patient case rather than a warning about imminent physical danger. "Grace," she said, "thank you. I'll be careful." Grace stared at her. Something about Elena's response didn't sit right. It was too calm, too measured, like being told that the CEO of your hospital was a violent predator was just another piece of clinical information to file away. "You understand what I'm telling you, right?" Grace said. "This isn't just a bad boss. This man puts his hands on people." "I understand," Elena said, and she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a dismissive smile, but the kind of smile that a person gives when they know something you don't. Grace left the break room feeling unsettled in a way she couldn't explain. She'd given the same warning to every new nurse who'd started on her floor for the past 5 years. They always reacted with fear or shock or denial. Some of them cried. One of them walked out of the building that same day and never came back. Elena Vasquez had smiled. The second morning came an hour later, in the supply closet. A nurse named Miguel found Elena restocking IV supplies and spoke in rapid, nervous sentences. He told her about the time Marcus had grabbed a charge nurse named David by the front of his scrubs and slapped him in the stairwell. He told her David had been trying to save a patient's life when he paged Marcus during a board dinner. The patient died 2 days later. David was never the same. Elena listened. She thanked Miguel. She went back to her patients. The third warning came from Patricia, a quiet, middle-aged nurse who worked the telemetry unit. Patricia found Elena in the medication room and told her, almost in tears, about watching Marcus slap a colleague 3 years ago. I just stood there, Patricia said. I stood there and watched, and I did nothing. I think about it every single day. It wasn't your fault, Elena said. It was, Patricia whispered. It was all of our faults. Every time we stay quiet, it's our fault. Elena put her hand on Patricia's shoulder. She squeezed gently. You're not quiet anymore, she said. You're telling me right now. Patricia wiped her eyes and almost laughed. A lot of good that does, telling the new girl to run. I'm not running, Elena said. Something in her voice made Patricia look at her differently. There was weight behind those 3 words. Not bravado, not naivety, something heavier. Something that Patricia couldn't quite identify, but that made the hair on her arms stand up. On her second day, Elena was charting at the nurses' station when the elevator doors opened and Marcus Blackwell stepped onto the 4th floor. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. 2 nurses who'd been chatting at the coffee machine went silent and scattered. A physician who'd been leaning against the counter suddenly straightened and found somewhere else to be. Janet, the unit manager, appeared from nowhere and positioned herself near the hallway entrance like a sentinel trying to intercept an incoming threat. Marcus walked the floor the way a general walks through occupied territory, slow, deliberate. His eyes moved from face to face, lingering just long enough to make each person feel examined and found wanting. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most of the nurses made in a week. His shoes clicked on the linoleum with a rhythm that had become the most dreaded sound in the building. Elena was sitting at the station, documenting a patient assessment. She heard the shoes. She heard the silence that followed them. She felt the energy shift around her as every person in the vicinity contracted, became smaller, tried to disappear. She kept writing. Marcus passed the nurse's station. His eyes swept across it and landed on Elena. New face. He didn't recognize her. She looked up from her chart, met his gaze directly, and nodded once. A polite, professional acknowledgement. The kind of nod you'd give any colleague passing in a hallway. Then she went back to her charting. Marcus paused for half a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But Grace, who was watching from behind a computer screen 12 feet away, noticed. She saw Marcus register something. Not offense, not anger, confusion. Because every single person in this hospital either avoided his eyes or greeted him with desperate, fearful deference. Elena had done neither. She'd simply acknowledged him as a person, an equal. And then she'd returned to her work as if he were no more remarkable than anyone else. Marcus moved on. He continued his rounds, criticized a housekeeping aide for a smudge on a window, and disappeared into the elevator. Grace exhaled. She looked at Elena, who was still charting as if nothing had happened. Do you know who that was? Grace asked. The CEO, Elena said without looking up. Marcus Blackwell. And you just looked at him, right in the eye. Elena finished her note, signed it, and closed the chart. Was I supposed to look somewhere else? Grace opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know what to say. In 8 years, she'd never seen anyone react to Marcus Blackwell with complete indifference. Not fake indifference, the kind where you pretend not to care while your heart hammers in your chest. Elena's pulse hadn't changed. Her handwriting hadn't wavered. She'd looked at the most feared man in the hospital and felt nothing. Or at least, nothing that showed. What Grace didn't see, what nobody saw, was what Elena did after her shift ended that night. She sat in her car in the Crestwood parking lot for 45 minutes. She didn't listen to music. She didn't check her phone. She sat in the driver's seat, both hands on the wheel, and she went through her mental catalog. Marcus Blackwell, right-handed, dominant posture, approaches from the front when asserting authority, raises his voice before escalating physically, targets people who are isolated, smaller, or in subordinate positions, uses open hand strikes, aims for the face, no formal training, pure intimidation, relying on shock and the victim's unwillingness to fight back. Elena had seen men like Marcus before, not in hospitals, but in places far more dangerous. In Fallujah, where she'd treated wounded Marines while bullets punched through the walls around her. In Helmand Province, where she'd held a 19-year-old private's hand while a medic tried to stop the bleeding from wounds that couldn't be stopped. In training facilities where she'd spent thousands of hours learning exactly how to take a larger, stronger person to the ground without causing permanent injury. Marcus Blackwell was a bully, and Elena had spent her entire adult life learning that bullies were only powerful when nobody stood up to them. She started the car and drove home. On her third day, something happened that changed the way every physician on the floor looked at Elena. A patient named Robert, 71 years old, recovering from hip replacement surgery, began showing signs that his blood pressure medication was interacting badly with his post-surgical pain management. The symptoms were subtle: slight confusion, mild dizziness, a blood pressure reading that was lower than expected, but not yet in the danger zone. Most nurses would have noted it and monitored. Elena called the attending physician directly. Dr. James Chen picked up the phone and listened as Elena laid out her observations. She didn't just report numbers, she connected them. She explained the potential interaction, referenced the patient's medication history, and suggested a specific adjustment. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been nursing?" 12 years. Where were you before Crestwood? Community hospital in New Mexico. Before that, military. Military. Dr. Chen paused. What branch? Marines. Another pause. Implement the adjustment you suggested. I'll co-sign the order. When Elena hung up, a nursing student who'd been shadowing her that morning said, "That was incredible. You basically diagnosed an interaction that the pharmacist missed." Elena shrugged. "I just read the chart carefully." But she hadn't just read the chart. She'd read it the way she'd been trained to read field reports during her deployments, looking for patterns, anticipating problems before they became crises, connecting data points that other people saw as isolated pieces of information. By the end of day 3, word had spread among the medical staff. The new nurse on 4 was sharp, really sharp, the kind of nurse who made doctors better at their jobs because she caught things they missed and communicated concerns with clarity and precision. The charge nurse told Janet that Crestwood was lucky to have Elena. Janet agreed, but she also felt something she couldn't quite articulate, a low-level unease. Not about Elena's competence, about Elena herself. There was something underneath the gentleness that Janet couldn't put her finger on, a stillness that didn't match the nervous energy of everyone else in the building, a groundedness that seemed almost unnatural in a place where everyone walked on eggshells. On the night of her third day, Elena went to check on a patient named Walter Harrison, 83 years old, Korean War veteran, recovering from pneumonia. He'd been gruff and difficult with the other nurses, refusing to eat, refusing to do his breathing exercises, telling everyone who came into his room that he wanted to be left alone. Elena walked in and sat down in the chair next to his bed. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. Walter glared at her. "I said I want to be left alone." "I know," Elena said. "I'll go in a minute. I just want to sit for a second." Long shift. Walter huffed. But he didn't tell her to leave again. They sat in silence for 2 minutes. Then Walter said, "You're different from the others." "How so?" "You don't look scared all the time. Everyone in this damn hospital looks like they're waiting for somebody to yell at them. You don't." Elena smiled. "I've been yelled at by people a lot scarier than anyone in this hospital." Walter's eyes narrowed. He studied her face. He studied the way she sat. Shoulders back, hands relaxed in her lap, weight balanced even in a chair. He'd seen that posture before. 50 years ago, in a field hospital in Korea, on the nurses who worked under mortar fire. "You're military," Walter said. It wasn't a question. Elena met his eyes. "Marines, 8 years." Walter was quiet for a long time. Then he said, My nurse in Korea was a woman about your size. She carried me 200 yards to a helicopter under fire. 200 yards. I weighed 180 pounds, and she was maybe 130 soaking wet. I asked her later how she did it. You know what she said? What? She said, I didn't think about it. I just decided you weren't going to die. Walter's voice cracked. That woman saved my life by deciding. That's all it was, a decision. Elena reached over and took Walter's hand. His skin was thin and papery, but his grip was firm. Eat your dinner, Walter, she said gently, and do your breathing exercises. I need you to get better. Walter looked at her hand holding his. He looked at her face. And for the first time since he'd been admitted, he nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said. Elena squeezed his hand and stood up. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. Walter was already reaching for his dinner tray. She walked back to the nurse's station, and Grace was there, watching her with an expression that hovered between admiration and confusion. He hasn't eaten in 2 days, Grace said. What did you say to him? We just talked, Elena said. Grace shook her head slowly. You've been here 3 days and you've already done things I can't explain. The way you handled Dr. Chen, the way you just got Walter to eat, the way you looked Marcus Blackwell in the eye like he was nobody. Elena began organizing her charts. He is nobody, Grace. Grace stared at her. He runs this hospital. He runs this hospital because everyone lets him. That's not power, that's permission. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Grace felt them ripple through her. She wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the reasons why it wasn't that simple. But something about the way Elena said it, something about the absolute certainty in her voice, made Grace wonder for the first time in 8 years if maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about what was possible. Day 4, Day 5, Day 6. Elena worked her shifts and watched Marcus from a distance. She tracked his patterns with military precision. He visited the 4th floor every Tuesday and Thursday between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. He was most aggressive on Mondays and Fridays, the beginnings and ends of his administrative week. He targeted nurses who were alone. He never struck anyone when multiple physicians were present. He chose moments when witnesses were few and unlikely to intervene. She filed every observation away the way she'd once filed intelligence reports, building a picture, identifying vulnerabilities, preparing. On day 7, she heard that Marcus had screamed at a pharmacy technician until the young woman hyperventilated and had to be treated in the ER. Elena found Grace in the break room afterward. The pharmacy tech, Elena said. Is she okay? Grace looked exhausted. They gave her a sedative. She'll be out for the rest of the shift. 3rd panic attack this year. She's 24 years old, Elena. 24. Elena sat down. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Grace, how long are you going to let this go on? Grace flinched. That's not fair. I'm not trying to be fair. I'm asking a real question. How long? What am I supposed to do? I'm one person. He's the CEO. He's got the board. He's got HR. He's got everybody. Danielle was one person. She filed a complaint. And he destroyed her. He destroyed her because she was alone. Because everyone who saw what happened suddenly couldn't remember. Elena leaned forward. What if they remembered, Grace? What if next time every single person who saw it told the truth? Grace's eyes filled with tears. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to stop being afraid. That's easy for you to say. You just got here. You don't know what he's capable of. Elena looked at Grace, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression. The gentleness was still there, but behind it, Grace saw something else. Something hard and bright and absolutely unbreakable. It was the look of a woman who'd seen things that made Marcus Blackwell look like a child throwing a tantrum. Grace, Elena said quietly, I know exactly what men like him are capable of. And I know exactly what happens when good people decide they've had enough. Grace wiped her eyes. She wanted to believe. God, she wanted to believe. But 8 years of fear doesn't evaporate because a new nurse with steady eyes tells you to be brave. Just be careful, Grace said. Please. Elena nodded. She stood up, squeezed Grace's shoulder, and walked out of the break room. Tomorrow was day 8. Tomorrow, Elena would be floated to the emergency department to cover a staffing shortage. Tomorrow evening, an elderly woman named Catherine Hargrove would arrive by ambulance with symptoms of a stroke. Tomorrow, Marcus Blackwell would come storming into that ER looking for someone to punish, and Elena Vasquez would be standing between him and her patient, waiting. She'd been waiting her whole life. The call came at 5:17 on Friday morning. Elena's phone buzzed on her nightstand, and she picked it up on the first ring. She was already awake. She'd been awake since 4. Elena, it's Janet. I need you in the ER today. We're short 3 nurses, and the evening shift has nobody to cover. Can you float down? I'll be there, Elena said. She hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, hands resting on her knees. Her heartbeat was steady, 62 beats per minute, the same resting rate she'd maintained during her 3rd deployment when mortars hit the base at 0300 and she'd had to triage 11 casualties in under 10 minutes. Elena got dressed. She ate breakfast. She drove to Crestwood. She parked in the same spot she'd parked in every day that week. And before she got out of the car, she looked at the photograph she kept tucked into her sun visor. Her mother, Maria, smiling, fierce, dying, but still fighting. Today might be the day, Mama, Elena said quietly. I'm ready. She clipped her badge to her scrubs and walked through the main entrance at 6:30. The emergency department at Crestwood operated on a different frequency than the medical surgical floor. Everything moved faster. Voices were louder. The energy was sharper, more urgent, more chaotic. Elena absorbed it the way she'd absorbed the energy of a forward operating base. She didn't fight it, she calibrated to it. The ER charge nurse, a stocky man named Dennis, briefed her at the nurses' station. We've got 12 patients currently, 3 waiting for beds upstairs, 2 in observation. It's been steady but manageable. That'll change around 8 tonight when the Friday crowd starts rolling in. Understood, Elena said. Dennis looked at her. He'd heard about the new nurse on 4, the one who was good, the one who'd gotten Walter Harrison to eat. You done ER work before? 12 years, 4 of them in emergency, 2 of those in a combat zone. Dennis raised his eyebrows. Combat zone? Marines. Dennis nodded slowly. All right then, you're assigned to bays 7 through 12. Call me if you need anything, but something tells me you won't. Elena smiled. I'll let you know. The shift started clean. A teenage boy with a skateboarding injury. A middle-aged woman with chest pain that turned out to be acid reflux. An elderly man who'd fallen in his bathroom and needed stitches above his left eye. Elena moved through each case with precision and warmth. She was efficient without being rushed. She was thorough without being slow. The ER physicians noticed immediately. Dr. Carla Reeves, the attending on duty, pulled Dennis aside at 3 in the afternoon. Where did you find her? She floated down from 4. Can we keep her? Dennis almost laughed. Get in line. At 4:45, Elena was restocking supplies in Bay 9 when she heard Grace's voice behind her. Elena turned. Grace was standing in the doorway in street clothes, her purse over her shoulder. She wasn't supposed to be in the ER. She wasn't even supposed to be in the building. Her shift had ended 2 hours ago. Grace, what are you doing here? Grace looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her hands were fidgeting with her purse strap. I heard you got floated to the ER. I did. Elena, listen to me. Marcus is in a bad mood today, really bad. He tore into the surgical department this morning over budget numbers. He made Dr. Patel cry in front of her entire team. An attending surgeon, Elena, he made her cry. And then he told the whole department they were all replaceable. Elena set down the supplies she was holding. Okay? It's Friday. He's always worse on Fridays. And the ER, Elena, the ER is where he comes when he wants to make a point. It's his favorite hunting ground because everything moves fast, and people are already stressed, and nobody has time to think clearly. Grace, I'm serious. If something goes wrong tonight, if there's a delay or a complaint or anything that gives him a reason to come down here, he will come, and he will find someone to punish. Elena stepped closer to Grace. She put both hands on Grace's arms and looked her directly in the eyes. Grace, go home. Get some rest. Whatever happens tonight, I can handle it. You keep saying that. You keep saying you can handle it, but you don't know him. I know exactly what he is. Then you know he'll hurt you. He will physically hurt you if you give him a reason. Elena held Grace's gaze. She didn't blink. She didn't waver. He can try. Grace's breath caught. There it was again. That thing she couldn't name. That hard, bright certainty behind Elena's gentle eyes. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't recklessness. It was something else. Something that came from a place Grace had never been and couldn't fully understand. Please be careful, Grace whispered. I promise, Elena said. Now go home. Grace left. She drove home. She sat in her kitchen and stared at her phone for the next 4 hours, waiting for a call she prayed wouldn't come. 6:15. The ER was getting busier. A car accident brought in 2 patients with minor injuries. A child arrived with a 103-degree fever, and a mother who was frantic with worry. Elena triaged, assessed, comforted, and managed. She was everywhere she needed to be at exactly the moment she needed to be there. At 7:22, the ambulance radio crackled. Incoming stroke patient, 78-year-old female, left-sided weakness, slurred speech, onset approximately 40 minutes ago. Dennis coordinated the response. Elena, you're taking this one. Bay 4. Doctor, Reeves is standing by. Copy, Elena said. The ambulance arrived at 7:29. The paramedics wheeled in Catherine Hargrove on a gurney. She was conscious but terrified. Her left arm hung limp at her side. Her words came out garbled, each syllable a struggle. Her eyes darted around the room with the wild, unfocused panic of someone whose own body had just become a stranger. Elena was at her side before the gurney stopped moving. She took Catherine's right hand, the one that still worked, and held it firmly. Mrs. Hargrove, my name is Elena. I'm your nurse. You're at Crestwood Regional, and we're going to take care of you. I need you to look at me. Can you do that? Catherine's eyes found Elena's face and locked on. Good, that's good. You're having some trouble with your left side and your speech right now, and I know that's frightening, but you're in the right place, and we're going to figure out exactly what's going on. I'm not going to leave you, okay? Catherine squeezed Elena's hand. Her grip was weak and trembling, but it was there. She nodded. Dr. Reeves ordered an immediate CT scan and full blood workup. The labs were drawn in under 3 minutes, but the CT scanner was occupied. A 23-year-old trauma patient from a motorcycle accident was in the scanner, and the radiologist estimated at least another 15 to 20 minutes before it would be available. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was emergency medicine. Resources are finite, priorities shift. The trauma patient's injuries were life-threatening and required immediate imaging. Catherine Hargrove's symptoms were serious but stable enough to wait. The clinical decision was sound. Elena stayed at Catherine's bedside. She monitored her neurological status every 2 minutes. She talked to her in that steady, gentle voice, explaining everything that was happening, keeping the fear at bay. Catherine's vitals held. Her symptoms weren't worsening. The wait was medically appropriate. At 7:51, Marcus Blackwell's phone buzzed. He was in his office on the 6th floor, reviewing a presentation for Monday's board meeting. The text was from Richard Hargrove, board member, major donor, the man who'd personally championed Marcus's contract renewal last year. Marcus, my wife Catherine was just brought to your ER by ambulance. Possible stroke. It's been 20 minutes and nobody has told me anything. What the hell is going on? Marcus read the text twice. His jaw tightened. His face flushed. He didn't call the ER. He didn't send a message asking for an update. He didn't pause to consider that emergency departments operate on clinical priority, not social hierarchy. He stood up. He straightened his tie. And he walked to the elevator with the specific stride that everyone at Crestwood had learned to fear. Fast, deliberate, his shoes hammering the floor like a countdown. 7:54. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor. Marcus turned toward the emergency department. A security guard saw him coming and stepped out of his path without being asked. An administrative assistant who was walking toward him with a stack of files turned and went the other direction. 7:55. Dennis saw Marcus coming through the corridor. His stomach dropped. He'd been charge nurse long enough to recognize what was about to happen. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Marcus and the ER entrance. "Mr. Blackwell, good evening. If you're here about Mrs. Hargrove, I can give you a full update. She's stable and being monitored. The CT scanner is currently in use with a trauma case, but she's next in line and we expect imaging within 15 minutes. Marcus didn't slow down. "Get out of my way." "Sir, if I could just explain the clinical situation. The trauma patient in the scanner has injuries that required immediate—" Marcus pushed past Dennis with enough force to knock the clipboard out of his hands. Dennis stumbled sideways. Papers scattered across the floor. Marcus didn't look back. 7:56. Dr. Reeves saw Marcus storming through the ER and moved to intercept. She was an attending physician with 17 years of experience. She was not easily intimidated. But she'd worked at Crestwood long enough to know what Marcus Blackwell looked like when he was about to explode. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm the attending physician on duty. Mrs. Hargrove is my patient and she's receiving appropriate care. The imaging delay is due to a competing emergency that took priority based on clinical acuity. I can assure you—" "I don't want your assurances," Marcus snapped. "I want to know why a board member's wife has been sitting in your ER for 30 minutes without a scan." "Because a 23-year-old with a traumatic brain injury needed the scanner first. That's how emergency medicine works, Mr. Blackwell." Marcus leaned into Dr. Reeves's space. "I don't need a lecture on how emergency medicine works from someone I can replace with a phone call. Where is she?" Dr. Reeves pointed toward Bay 4. Her hand was steady, but her jaw was tight. She'd just been threatened by the CEO of her hospital in front of half the ER staff, and there was nothing she could do about it. 7:57. Marcus reached the doorway of Bay 4. Elena was standing at Catherine Hargrove's bedside, holding her hand, monitoring the cardiac display above the bed. Catherine had calmed significantly in the past 20 minutes. Her vitals were stable. Her fear had been replaced by the kind of trust that only comes when a patient believes, truly believes, that their nurse will not let anything bad happen to them. Marcus's voice hit the room like a detonation. "What the hell is going on in here? Why hasn't this patient been scanned?" Catherine Hargrove flinched. Her heart rate spiked from 78 to 109 in 3 seconds. The cardiac monitor started beeping faster. Her eyes went wide. Her right hand, the one that still worked, gripped Elena's fingers so hard her knuckles turned white. Elena felt the spike. She saw the numbers jump on the monitor. She knew, with the clinical certainty of 12 years of nursing and 8 years of military medicine, that this level of sudden stress could worsen a stroke patient's condition catastrophically. A blood pressure surge could cause a hemorrhagic conversion. The stroke could expand. Damage that was currently manageable could become permanent or fatal. Marcus Blackwell was killing her patient. Elena turned to face him. Her body shifted into a position that nobody in that ER recognized, but that any Marine would have identified instantly. Weight centered, knees slightly bent, shoulders squared but relaxed. She placed herself between Marcus and Catherine's bed. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, just deliberately. "Mr. Blackwell." Her voice was calm and clear, and carried the authority of someone who was not asking. Mrs. Hargrove is a stroke patient who requires a low-stimulus environment. The CT scanner will be available in approximately 12 minutes. The delay is clinically appropriate. I need you to lower your voice. The ER went quiet. Dennis, who'd followed Marcus from the corridor, stopped moving. Dr. Reeves, who'd been 10 steps behind, froze. Patricia, who happened to be dropping off lab results from the 4th floor, turned and saw everything. A medical student named James Park looked up from his charting and felt his pen go still in his hand. Marcus stared at Elena. His face was crimson. A vein pulsed in his temple. His fists were clenched at his sides. "Who are you?" His voice was low and shaking with rage. "I'm the nurse caring for your patient." "She's not my patient. She's the wife of a man who funds this hospital. And you're a nurse who apparently doesn't understand the chain of command." "I understand the chain of command perfectly, Mr. Blackwell. My chain of command starts with the patient. Mrs. Hargrove's neurological status requires a calm environment. I'm going to have to ask you to step into the hallway." For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Elena had just told the CEO of Crestwood Regional Medical Center to leave a patient's room. In front of a dozen witnesses, in a voice that was quiet but left no room for negotiation, Marcus took a step toward her. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes. Do you have any idea what I can do to your career?" "That's not relevant to this patient's care. You're fired, do you hear me? You're finished. I want you out of this hospital in the next 5 minutes, or I'll have security drag you out." Elena didn't move. "Mr. Blackwell, I understand you're upset, but I'm not going to leave my patient. If you'd like to discuss this in the hallway, I'm happy to do that once Mrs. Hargrove is stable and transferred to imaging." "I'm not going to the hallway. I'm not going anywhere. You are." He moved closer. Elena held her ground. Behind her, Catherine Hargrove's monitor was beeping faster. 1:15, 1:20, the numbers were climbing. Every second Marcus spent screaming was another second of stress on a brain that was already under assault. Patricia caught Elena's eye from the nurse's station. She shook her head, tiny, desperate. Don't engage. Don't give him a reason." Elena saw her. She saw the fear in Patricia's face. She saw the same fear in Dennis's eyes, in Dr. Reeves's rigid posture, in the frozen expression of every person within earshot. She saw 8 years of silence. She saw 14 nurses who'd been hit and nobody who'd ever stopped it. She saw her mother's face. "Promise me." Marcus was 6 inches from Elena now. His breath was hot on her face. His body was coiled with the kind of rage that had been rewarded for 5 straight years. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he said. "You think you can stand there and tell me what to do in my own hospital?" Elena said nothing. She stood perfectly still. Her hands were at her sides, open, relaxed. Her breathing was even. Her heart rate was 64 beats per minute. Marcus raised his right hand. The motion was fast, practiced. His arm came up in a wide arc, palm open, aimed directly at Elena's left cheek. The same strike he'd used on Danielle, on Priya, on David, on 14 other nurses who'd never seen it coming and never had the ability to stop it. Elena saw it coming from the moment his shoulders shifted. She had 1.8 seconds. She needed less than 1. Her left hand came up and intercepted Marcus's wrist at the peak of its arc. Not a grab, not a block, a redirect. She caught the momentum of his swing and turned it, using his own force against him the way water turns a stone. Her right hand moved to his elbow in the same fluid motion, applying pressure at a precise angle to the joint, a technique called a standing armbar that she'd taught to 200 Marines during her years as a combat instructor. Marcus's arm locked. His body had no choice but to follow the direction of the force. His balance broke. His center of gravity shifted forward and down. Elena pivoted her hips, maintained absolute control of his arm, and guided Marcus Blackwell to the floor of the emergency department with a technique so clean that it looked choreographed. His knees hit the linoleum. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. 1.8 seconds. From the moment his hand rose to the moment he was on the ground, Marcus's face registered something that nobody at Crestwood had ever seen on him before. Pure, unfiltered shock. His brain couldn't process what had just happened. He was on the floor. A nurse had put him on the floor. He was being held in a position that he couldn't break free from, no matter how hard he struggled. And he tried. He pulled against Elena's grip and felt the pressure increase just enough to send a bolt of pain through his elbow. "Let go of me," he gasped. His voice was strangled, high-pitched, nothing like the commanding roar that had terrorized hundreds of people. Let go of me." Elena held him. Her grip was precise, not painful, but inescapable. She wasn't hurting him. She was controlling him the way you'd control a patient in a psychotic episode. Minimum necessary force, maximum control. Protect the subject from harming themselves or others. "Please," Marcus said. The word came out broken and desperate. "Please let me go." Patricia's hand was over her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face. Dennis was gripping the edge of the nurse's station so hard, his knuckles were white. Dr. Reeves stood absolutely still, her clinical mind analyzing the technique Elena had used, recognizing it as something far beyond anything taught in a self-defense class. James Park, the medical student, had dropped his pen. It lay on the floor, forgotten. Catherine Hargrove had gone quiet. Her monitor was still beeping fast, but she was staring at the woman who'd been holding her hand moments ago. The gentle nurse with the musical voice, now holding the most powerful man in the hospital on the floor with one hand, as if it required no effort at all. Elena held Marcus for 3 more seconds. She looked down at him and said quietly, so that only he could hear, "You will never touch another nurse again." Then she released him. She stepped back, her hands returned to her sides. Her breathing was unchanged. Her face was exactly what it had been before the confrontation. Calm, professional, steady. Marcus scrambled to his feet. His suit was wrinkled. His tie was twisted sideways. His hair was disheveled. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't straighten his jacket. He looked around the ER, searching for the authority he'd carried for 5 years, and found nothing. It was gone. It had evaporated the moment his knees hit the floor. He pointed a trembling finger at Elena. "You're fired! You assaulted me! Security! Someone call security! I want her arrested!" His voice cracked on the word arrested. He was trying to sound commanding, but every person in that room had just heard him beg. The mask was off. The Emperor had no clothes, and everyone could see it. Then Patricia spoke. Patricia, who'd spent 8 years in silence. Patricia, who'd watched a colleague get slapped and done nothing. Patricia, who'd warned Elena to stay invisible. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "He's lying." Every head turned. "I saw the whole thing," Patricia said. "He tried to hit her. She stopped him. That's all that happened." The silence that followed was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Then Dr. Reeves spoke. "I corroborate that account completely. Mr. Blackwell was physically aggressive toward a staff member who was protecting a vulnerable patient. The nurse used appropriate defensive force." Dennis stepped forward. "I saw it too. He pushed past me to get in here. He was out of control from the moment he walked in." James Park, the medical student, raised his hand like he was in a classroom. "I saw everything. She didn't attack him. He attacked her. She just stopped him." One voice, then 2, then 5. Then every single person who'd witnessed what happened was talking, confirming, corroborating. 8 years of silence crumbling in 30 seconds. Marcus's face drained of color. He looked from face to face, searching for an ally, searching for someone who would back him the way witnesses had always backed him before. He found nothing. Every face stared back at him with something he'd never seen directed at him at Crestwood Regional Medical Center. Not fear, contempt. The risk management director arrived 4 minutes later. Security arrived 2 minutes after that. Marcus tried to reassert control. He demanded Elena's termination. He threatened criminal charges. He invoked his authority as CEO. The risk management director, a woman named Sandra Chen, held up her hand. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm going to ask you to step outside the emergency department while we assess this situation." "You're going to ask me? Do you know who you're talking to?" "I know exactly who I'm talking to, and I'm advising you, in the strongest possible terms, to cooperate with security right now. The liability implications of this situation are significant, and anything you say or do from this point forward will be documented." Marcus looked at Sandra. He looked at the security officers flanking her. He looked at Elena, who was already back at Catherine Hargrove's bedside, checking her vitals, holding her hand, murmuring reassurances as if nothing had happened. As if putting the CEO on the floor was just another task she'd completed before returning to her patient. Marcus Blackwell walked out of the emergency department, escorted by 2 security officers. His shoes clicked on the linoleum, but the sound was different now. Not powerful, not commanding, just the sound of a man walking away from everything he'd built, knowing he'd never get it back. Behind him, in Bay 4, Catherine Hargrove's heart rate was coming down. 110, 105, 98, 90. Elena squeezed her hand. "You're doing great, Mrs. Hargrove. The scanner's almost ready. We're going to take good care of you." Catherine looked up at her nurse. Her words were still slurred, still difficult, but she managed two that everyone nearby could hear. "Thank you." Elena smiled, the same gentle, warm smile she'd worn since the day she walked into Crestwood. "That's my job." 12 feet away, Patricia was leaning against the wall, crying. Not from sadness, not from fear, from something she'd forgotten existed. Relief. Grace's phone rang at 8:31. She picked up before the first ring finished. "Grace, it's Patricia." Patricia's voice was shaking. "You need to come back to the hospital." Grace's stomach dropped. "What happened? Is Elena okay?" "Elena's fine. Marcus isn't." "Grace, she put him on the floor. She put Marcus Blackwell on the floor of the ER in front of everybody." Grace sat down on her kitchen floor. Her legs simply gave out. "What?" He tried to hit her. He raised his hand and she took him down. One move. He was on the ground begging her to let go. Grace, he was begging. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God." "And Grace, we talked. All of us. We told the truth. Every single person who saw it told the truth. Nobody lied for him. Nobody pretended they didn't see it." Grace was crying now, full, shaking sobs. 8 years of swallowed fear and buried shame came flooding out of her in a wave that she couldn't have stopped if she'd tried. "Grace, are you okay?" "Patricia," Grace said through her tears. "I told her to keep her head down. On her first day, I told her to stay invisible. I told her that was how you survive." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe she came here to teach us a different way to survive." Grace hung up the phone. She sat on her kitchen floor for 10 minutes. Then she got up, washed her face, got in her car, and drove back to Crestwood Regional Medical Center. She had a statement to give. Grace arrived at Crestwood at 9:47 that Friday night. She'd driven 22 minutes in the dark with tears still drying on her cheeks, and her hands gripping the wheel so tight her fingers ached. She parked, walked through the main entrance, and went straight to the administrative floor where Sandra Chen, the risk management director, had set up an impromptu interview room. Sandra looked up when Grace appeared in the doorway. "Grace, your shift ended hours ago." "I know, I'm here to give a statement." "About what happened in the ER tonight?" "About what's been happening in this hospital for 8 years. Sandra set down her pen. She studied Grace's face, the red eyes, the rigid jaw, the expression of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't going to be talked out of it. Sandra gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down." Grace sat. She folded her hands in her lap, and then she started talking. She talked for 93 minutes. She told Sandra about Danielle Porter, about the slap in the hallway, about the 9 witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember what they'd seen. She told her about Priya, slapped twice behind a closed office door, about David, hid in the stairwell for trying to save a patient's life. She told her about Tom, the only nurse who'd backed Danielle's complaint, transferred and driven out within 2 months. She told Sandra about the culture of fear, about the whispered warnings, about the survival strategies everyone had developed. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak up. Don't question anything. She told her about nurses who'd left the profession entirely, about the pharmacy technician who'd had 3 panic attacks in 1 year, about the constant grinding terror of working in a building where the CEO could destroy you on a whim and nobody would lift a finger to stop him. And then Grace told Sandra something she'd never told anyone. 3 years ago, Grace said, her voice barely holding, Marcus grabbed my arm in the medication room. He twisted it behind my back because I'd forgotten to update a whiteboard. A whiteboard. He held my arm until I said I was sorry. I had bruises for 2 weeks. I wore long sleeves in the middle of July so nobody would see. Sandra stopped writing. She looked at Grace. "Did you report it?" Grace laughed. It was a horrible sound. "Report it to who? HR works for him. The board works for him. Everyone works for him. Who was I supposed to tell?" "You're telling me now." Because a woman I tried to warn to keep her head down just put Marcus Blackwell on the floor of the emergency department. Because she did in 2 seconds what I should have done 8 years ago. Grace's voice broke. "I'm so ashamed, Sandra. I've been so ashamed for so long." Sandra reached across the table and put her hand on Grace's. "You're here now. That's what matters." Grace wiped her eyes. "There are others, a lot of others. They'll talk now. I know they will. We just needed someone to go first." She was right. By Saturday morning, Sandra's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Word of what happened in the ER had spread through the hospital like fire through dry grass. Nurses who'd worked the Friday night shift told nurses coming in for the Saturday morning shift. Those nurses texted colleagues who were off duty. Former employees who still had friends at Crestwood received calls and messages. Within 12 hours, the story had reached every person who'd ever worked under Marcus Blackwell, and they were ready to talk. Sandra called the hospital's chief legal officer at 7 in the morning. "We have a situation that's bigger than one incident," she said. "I need an external investigator. Today. It's Saturday. I don't care what day it is. Get me someone today. We're going to have people lining up to give statements by Monday morning, and I need a process in place before that happens." The external investigator, a former federal prosecutor named Diana Walsh, arrived at Crestwood by 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon. Sandra briefed her for an hour. Diana reviewed the preliminary statements, the incident report from the ER, and the hospital's complaint history. "How many victims are we talking about?" Diana asked. "Physical assault, at least 14 that we know of. Verbal abuse, harassment, intimidation. The number could be in the dozens, maybe higher." Diana was quiet for a moment. She'd investigated corporate misconduct for 20 years. She'd seen embezzlement, fraud, sexual harassment on a massive scale. But something about this case, about the systematic physical abuse of nurses by a hospital CEO, hit differently. And the board knew? 3 formal complaints reached them over 5 years. All 3 were dismissed or minimized. "Then the board has liability too." "I'm aware." Diana set up in a conference room on the administrative floor Monday morning. She brought a legal assistant and a court reporter. She arranged for interviews to be confidential. And then she opened the door. They came one at a time. Some came in pairs, drawing courage from each other. A few came alone, shaking, barely able to speak above a whisper. But they came. Patricia was first. She sat in the chair across from Diana and told her about watching Marcus slap a colleague 3 years ago. She described standing there, frozen, doing nothing. She described the guilt that had eaten at her every day since. "I knew it was wrong," Patricia said. "I knew it every second of every day, but I was so afraid. He made us all so afraid." Dennis came next. He told Diana about being shoved by Marcus in the ER corridor on Friday night. He described the pattern of intimidation he'd witnessed over 4 years. He provided dates. He provided names. He provided details that HR had never documented because HR had never asked. Dr. Reeves gave a statement that lasted 2 hours. She described the verbal abuse she'd witnessed directed at other physicians. She described Marcus threatening to replace her during the ER confrontation. She described the medical danger his behavior had created for Catherine Hargrove, a stroke patient whose condition could have been catastrophically worsened by the stress Marcus introduced. A recovery room nurse named Angela described being screamed at for 20 minutes over a scheduling conflict. She'd gone home that night and taken 3 sleeping pills because she couldn't stop shaking. Her husband found her unresponsive and called 911. She spent the night in the ER of a different hospital. She never reported the incident. She never told anyone at Crestwood why she'd missed work the next day. An ICU nurse named Derek told Diana about watching Marcus fire a colleague in the middle of a shift. No warning, no process. The nurse had questioned a new protocol that she believed was unsafe for ventilator patients. Marcus walked onto the ICU floor, told her she was terminated, and had security escort her out while her patients were still in her care. Derek had to take over her patient load with no handoff. One of those patients coded that afternoon. He survived, but Derek never forgot the look on his colleague's face as she was marched out of the unit. A medical surgical nurse, her voice so quiet that the court reporter had to ask her to repeat herself twice, described Marcus grabbing her arm hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises. Her crime had been paging him about a patient who was deteriorating. It was 2 a.m. Marcus was at a hotel across town. He drove to the hospital, found her in the hallway, grabbed her arm, and told her that if she ever disturbed him again for anything less than a code blue, he would personally end her career. The patient she'd paged about was transferred to the ICU the next morning with sepsis. If she hadn't paged Marcus and the on-call attending hadn't intervened, the patient might have died. Each interview added weight. Each story confirmed the pattern. By Wednesday, Diana had taken 31 statements from current employees. By Friday, the number had risen to 43. Former employees began reaching out after word spread beyond the hospital. Then the twist that nobody expected. On Thursday of the second week, Diana received a call from a woman named Michelle Torres. Michelle was a nurse in Ohio. She'd never worked at Crestwood, but she'd worked at St. Luke's Medical Center in Columbus 7 years ago when Marcus Blackwell was the chief operating officer there. "I saw the news," Michelle said, "about the investigation at Crestwood, and I need to tell you something." "Go ahead." "He did the same things at St. Luke's. The yelling, the intimidation, the hitting. He slapped me in a conference room after I questioned a staffing decision. I filed a formal complaint. HR told me the investigation was inconclusive. Marcus told me I was lucky he didn't fire me. I resigned 6 weeks later." Diana's pen stopped moving. "Do you have documentation?" "I have everything. The complaint I filed, the emails where HR dismissed my concerns, a photograph of the bruise on my face that I took the night it happened. I've kept all of it for 7 years, waiting for someone to finally do something. Can you send me those documents?" "I'll send them tonight." Michelle wasn't the only one. Within a week, 2 more nurses from St. Luke's contacted Diana. Then a physician's assistant from a hospital in Virginia where Marcus had worked before Columbus. Then a lab supervisor from an urgent care network in Pennsylvania where Marcus had been a regional director a decade ago. The picture that emerged was devastating. Marcus Blackwell hadn't become a tyrant at Crestwood. He'd been a tyrant for his entire career. He'd moved from institution to institution, leaving a trail of traumatized staff behind him, his misconduct either unreported or inadequately addressed. His references somehow stayed clean. His reputation somehow stayed intact. The healthcare industry had passed him along like a live grenade, each organization relieved when he became someone else's problem. Diana compiled a timeline that stretched back 12 years across 4 institutions. Documented physical assaults, verbal abuse, retaliation against anyone who spoke up. A systematic pattern of predatory behavior enabled by institutional failure at every level. Meanwhile, Marcus was unraveling. He showed up to Crestwood the Monday after the incident as if nothing had happened. He walked through the front entrance in his usual suit, carrying his usual briefcase, wearing his usual expression of authority. But the security guard at the desk, the same guard Elena had smiled at on her first day, stood up and said, "Mr. Blackwell, I've been instructed to escort you directly to HR." Marcus stared at him. "Excuse me?" "Those are my instructions, sir. You're to report to HR before going to your office." "I don't report to HR. HR reports to me." "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." Something shifted in Marcus's face. For the first time, he looked like a man who understood that the ground beneath him had moved. He followed the security guard to HR without another word. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. He was informed that he was being placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. His access to the building would be limited to scheduled meetings with his attorney and the investigator. His email and phone access would be monitored. He was not to contact any current or former employees directly. Marcus's attorney, a partner at Charlotte's most expensive firm, objected to every condition. Sandra Chen listened politely and then said, "Your client attempted to strike an employee in front of multiple witnesses. He can accept these conditions voluntarily, or we can proceed directly to termination and let the courts sort out the rest." Marcus accepted the conditions, but he didn't stop fighting. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus called board members he'd cultivated for years. He reminded them of the profits he'd generated. He framed the incident as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a new employee with a grudge. He characterized the investigation as a witch hunt driven by disgruntled staff who couldn't handle high standards. He called 3 nurses he thought might be sympathetic. One was a charge nurse named Robert, who Marcus had promoted 2 years earlier. Marcus told Robert that people who cooperated with the investigation would be remembered, and not in a good way. Robert hung up the phone, drove to Crestwood, and reported the call to Diana Walsh. It was added to the file as evidence of witness intimidation. Marcus tried to contact Danielle Porter, the first nurse he'd ever slapped, the one who'd signed the NDA. He called her office in Raleigh. Danielle's receptionist said she was unavailable. Marcus left a message reminding Danielle that her non-disclosure agreement was still in effect and that any violation would result in legal action. Danielle listened to the message. Then she called a lawyer. Her lawyer reviewed the NDA and told her that agreements signed under duress, particularly those covering up criminal conduct, were potentially unenforceable. Danielle authorized her attorney to contact Diana Walsh. When Diana received Danielle's original complaint from 5 years ago, along with the contemporaneous medical records showing the bruise on her cheek and the emails where HR had dismissed her account, she added them to a file that was now over 400 pages long. The media broke the story on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the ER incident. A reporter at the Charlotte Observer named Vanessa Kim had received an anonymous tip. Her article was carefully worded but devastating. Crestwood CEO under investigation for pattern of workplace violence ran above the fold with a photograph of Marcus at a charity gala, smiling in a tuxedo. The article didn't name victims. It didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. Multiple employees had come forward alleging physical and verbal abuse. An external investigation was underway. The CEO had been placed on administrative leave. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by regional news. then national healthcare publications, then social media. Former Crestwood employees began sharing their experiences in comment sections. A hashtag started trending. Nursing organizations issued statements. Marcus hired a crisis management consultant who drafted a public statement painting Marcus as the victim of a coordinated attack by employees who couldn't meet his standards of excellence. The statement was released on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, 6 more former victims had contacted Diana Walsh in direct response to the statement, furious that Marcus was still trying to silence them. The board convened an emergency meeting on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 weeks after the incident. Every member attended. The atmosphere was thick with the awareness that whatever they decided would define Crestwood's future. Diana Walsh presented her findings. 90 minutes of documented evidence. 43 victim statements from Crestwood. 12 statements from former employees at other institutions. A timeline spanning 12 years. Physical evidence including photographs, medical records, emails, text messages, and the original complaints that had been ignored or suppressed. When Diana finished, the boardroom was silent. The board chair, a man named Philip Rutherford, who had personally defended Marcus at every previous complaint, sat with his head in his hands for a full 30 seconds before speaking. "We need to hear from the nurse, the one from the ER." Elena was called from the 4th floor. She walked into the boardroom in her scrubs, her badge still clipped to her chest. She'd come directly from a patient's bedside. She sat down across from 12 board members who held the power to validate or dismiss everything that had happened. Philip Rutherford looked at her. "Ms. Vasquez, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened on the evening of September 14th? Elena's account lasted 12 minutes. She described being assigned to Catherine Hargrove. She described the medically appropriate imaging delay. She described Marcus entering the ER in an agitated state and the immediate spike in her patient's cardiac indicators. She described positioning herself between Marcus and her patient. She described his verbal escalation. She described his attempt to strike her. She described the defensive techniques she'd used to bring him to the ground. She described releasing him once the threat was neutralized. No embellishment, no emotion, just facts. "Ms. Vasquez," Philip said, "the technique you used, where did you learn it?" "United States Marine Corps. I served 8 years, including multiple combat deployments. I was a combat medic and hand-to-hand combat instructor." The board members exchanged glances. Several of them shifted in their seats. The quiet, gentle nurse who'd taken down their CEO was a combat-trained Marine. "Do you feel your response was appropriate?" Philip asked. "I defended myself and protected a vulnerable patient from a hostile situation. I used the minimum force necessary to prevent harm. I would do the same thing again." Philip nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Vasquez." Elena stood. She paused at the door and turned back. "Mr. Rutherford, before I go, this board received 3 formal complaints about Marcus Blackwell over 5 years. 3. And you did nothing. 14 nurses were physically assaulted. Dozens more were verbally abused. Good people lost their careers. Some lost their love for nursing entirely. That didn't happen because of one bad man. It happened because the people with the power to stop him chose not to." She walked out. Philip Rutherford stared at the closed door for a long time. The board went into executive session. The deliberation lasted 45 minutes, though everyone in the building knew the outcome was predetermined. The evidence was overwhelming. The liability was catastrophic. Defending Marcus was no longer an option. When they reconvened, Philip read a statement prepared by the hospital's attorneys. Based on the findings of the independent investigation and the testimony of multiple witnesses, the board had determined that Marcus Blackwell had violated hospital policies, created a hostile work environment, and engaged in conduct unbecoming of a senior executive. His employment was terminated, effective immediately, for cause. No severance, no negotiated exit. Security escorted Marcus to his office at 4:17 that afternoon. He was given 30 minutes to collect personal belongings under supervision. He filled one box. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped a framed photograph and the glass shattered on the floor. He left the broken glass where it fell. Staff in the administrative corridor watched in silence as Marcus carried his box toward the main entrance. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody looked away either. For the first time, they watched him with their eyes wide open. Marcus pushed through the front doors and walked to his car. He put the box in his trunk. He got in the driver's seat. He sat there for several minutes, staring at the Crestwood sign through his windshield. Then he drove away. Inside the hospital, Dennis was standing at the ER nurses station when the overhead announcement came. Staff were informed that Marcus Blackwell was no longer employed at Crestwood Regional Medical Center, effective immediately. Dennis looked at the nurses around him. Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. The emotion was too deep for celebration. A respiratory therapist closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her chest. A young nurse sat down in a chair and put her head between her knees. An older physician who'd worked at Crestwood for 20 years took off his glasses and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Angela, the recovery room nurse who'd ended up in the ER after taking too many sleeping pills, stood in the hallway and whispered two words to nobody in particular. "It's over." Elena was with a patient when the announcement was made. She finished her assessment, documented her findings, and adjusted an IV drip. Then she stepped into the hallway, pulled out her phone, and opened the photograph of her mother. "I kept my promise, Mama," she said softly. "I kept my promise." She put the phone away and went to check on her next patient. 2 weeks after his termination, Marcus Blackwell was formally charged with 3 counts of misdemeanor assault. The district attorney's office announced the charges at a press conference that made national news. 3 former victims, including Priya and David, had agreed to testify. The evidence included eyewitness statements, medical records documenting injuries, and contemporaneous reports that had been ignored by hospital administration. Marcus's attorney issued a statement calling the charges politically motivated and vowing to fight them vigorously. The statement did not mention the 14 nurses Marcus had struck. It did not mention the 53 he'd verbally abused. It did not mention the careers he'd destroyed or the lives he'd damaged. But the world knew now, and Marcus Blackwell's name, which had once appeared in press releases next to words like visionary and transformational leader, now appeared next to a different word: defendant. The trial began on a Monday morning in March, 6 months after Elena Vasquez put Marcus Blackwell on the floor of the emergency department. Marcus arrived at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse in a navy suit that looked like it cost less than the ones he used to wear. His attorney walked beside him, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the strained expression of a man who knew his client's case was sinking before it started. Marcus kept his head up. He still had that walk, that deliberate, measured stride that had once made entire hospital floors go silent. But his face was different, thinner, harder. The confident smile that had charmed donors and board members was gone, replaced by a tight, controlled expression that cracked at the edges when he thought nobody was watching. Reporters shouted questions from behind the courthouse barriers. Marcus didn't answer. His attorney said, "My client looks forward to his day in court and is confident that justice will prevail." Inside the courtroom, the prosecution called their first witness, Priya Sharma. Priya had driven from her home in Raleigh, where she'd been working as a medical billing specialist since leaving nursing. She'd spent the previous night in a hotel room, unable to sleep, pacing, rehearsing what she would say, fighting the voice in her head that still sounded like Marcus, telling her she was nothing. She took the stand. The prosecutor, a woman named Catherine Bell, approached slowly. "Miss Sharma, can you describe what happened on March 12th, 4 years ago, in Mr. Blackwell's office at Crestwood Regional Medical Center?" Priya's hands were in her lap. They were shaking. She looked at Marcus, sitting at the defense table, and for a moment the fear was so strong that she couldn't speak. He was staring at her with those same cold eyes. the same eyes that had looked at her before he hit her. 4 years later, and the fear was still right there, alive, electric, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. Then Priya looked past Marcus to the gallery, where Elena Vasquez was sitting in the third row. Elena met her eyes and gave the smallest nod. Not a smile, not encouragement, just presence. "I'm here. You're not alone." Priya turned back to the prosecutor. "He called me into his office. He closed the door. I had questioned a new discharge protocol in a staff meeting earlier that day. I said I thought it was unsafe for elderly patients. He told me I had embarrassed him in front of the department. And then he slapped me twice, once on each cheek, hard enough that I tasted blood." The courtroom was silent. What did he say after that? "He told me that if I ever questioned his decisions again, he'd make sure I never worked in North Carolina again. Then he opened the door and told me to get out." Marcus's attorney objected, argued context, argued hearsay. The judge overruled him. Priya's testimony continued for 45 minutes. When she stepped down, her hands had stopped shaking. David Okafor testified next. The charged nurse who'd been slapped in the stairwell for paging Marcus during a board dinner to save a patient's life. David was a large man, 6'2", 220 pounds, and he sat in the witness chair with his shoulders hunched forward like he was trying to make himself smaller. "He grabbed the front of my scrubs," David said. "He pushed me against the wall. Then he hit me, and he said, 'You embarrassed me in front of people who matter.'" "What happened to the patient you were trying to help?" Catherine Bell asked. David's jaw tightened. "He died 2 days later." Was the patient's death related to the delay in obtaining authorization? Marcus's attorney objected. The judge sustained it. But the jury had already heard the words, "The patient died 2 days later." Those words hung in the courtroom air like smoke. The prosecution called 11 witnesses over 3 days. Current and former nurses, physicians, administrative staff. Each testimony built on the last, layering fact upon fact, incident upon incident, until the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't one bad day. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a man who had systematically terrorized the people who worked for him, who had used physical violence as a tool of control, who had operated with impunity because everyone around him was too afraid to stop him. Marcus's defense strategy was predictable. His attorney argued that Marcus was a demanding but effective leader who'd been targeted by employees who couldn't meet his high standards. He characterized the physical incidents as exaggerated or fabricated. He painted Elena as an unstable individual with military training who had assaulted his client without provocation. Then the defense made a mistake. They called Marcus to testify. Marcus took the stand on Thursday morning. His attorney walked him through a carefully rehearsed narrative. Yes, he had high expectations. Yes, he could be intense, but he had never, not once, struck an employee. The allegations were lies, coordinated by people who resented his success. Catherine Bell approached for cross-examination. She was calm, methodical. She started with simple questions about Marcus's management style. She let him talk. She let him build confidence. She let him settle into the version of himself he wanted the jury to see. Then she said, "Mr. Blackwell, you've testified that you never struck an employee at Crestwood Regional Medical Center. Is that correct?" "That's correct. You never struck Danielle Porter in the hallway outside Conference Room B on October 15th, 5 years ago." "I did not." "You never struck Priya Sharma in your office on March 12th, 4 years ago." "Absolutely not." Catherine walked to her table and picked up a document. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 47. This is a settlement agreement between Crestwood Regional Medical Center and Danielle Porter, dated November 3rd, 5 years ago. It includes a non-disclosure clause and a payment of $15,000. Can you explain why the hospital paid $15,000 to a nurse you claim you never struck?" Marcus's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Marcus stared at the document. That was a human resources matter. I wasn't involved in the details. You weren't involved in the settlement of a complaint that named you specifically as the perpetrator of a physical assault? HR handled it. I had nothing to do with it. Catherine picked up another document. Exhibit 48, an email from you to the head of Human Resources, dated October 17th, 5 years ago, 2 days after the incident with Miss Porter. The email reads, and I quote, "Make this go away, whatever it costs, and make sure she signs something that keeps her mouth shut." End quote. You wrote that email, Mr. Blackwell? The courtroom went still. Marcus's attorney was on his feet, objecting, requesting a sidebar. The judge called both attorneys to the bench. The whispered conference lasted 3 minutes. When they returned, the judge allowed the exhibit. Marcus's face had changed. The controlled expression was slipping. I don't recall the specific wording of that email. You don't recall telling HR to, quote, "make sure she signs something that keeps her mouth shut"? I may have used poor language. I was under a lot of pressure. Mr. Blackwell, were you under a lot of pressure when you struck Danielle Porter? I didn't strike her. Catherine picked up a photograph. Exhibit 49, a photograph taken by Danielle Porter on the evening of October 15th, 5 years ago. It shows a bruise on her left cheek, consistent with an open-handed strike. Miss Porter sent this photograph to her mother via text message at 9:14 that evening, along with a message that reads, "My boss hit me today. I don't know what to do." The metadata on the photograph confirms the date and time. Would you like to see it? Marcus didn't answer. Mr. Blackwell? I've answered your question. I didn't hit anyone. Catherine set the photograph down. She looked at the jury, then she looked back at Marcus. You've been CEO of 4 healthcare institutions over the past 12 years. At 3 of those institutions, employees have come forward with allegations of physical assault. In total, 17 individuals have provided sworn testimony describing incidents where you struck them. 17 people, Mr. Blackwell. Are all 17 of them lying? Marcus's attorney objected again. Argumentative. The judge overruled. Marcus leaned forward in the witness chair. His hands were gripping the armrests. His knuckles were white. People lie, he said. People with grudges lie. 17 people, across 4 hospitals, over 12 years, all with the same grudge? All telling the same lie? Marcus didn't answer. The silence lasted 5 seconds. In a courtroom, 5 seconds of silence after a direct question is an eternity. The jury watched Marcus's face, and what they saw was a man who had run out of lies. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of misdemeanor assault. Marcus stood motionless as the verdict was read. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. Marcus shrugged it off. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. The judge gave Marcus 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management counseling. Marcus's medical license was suspended indefinitely by the state medical board. The civil lawsuits filed by 14 former employees resulted in settlements totaling $2.3 million. Marcus's attorneys negotiated for months, but the evidence was so overwhelming that prolonged litigation would have only increased the damages. Marcus Blackwell lost his career, his reputation, his wealth, and his medical license. The man who'd told 17 nurses that he would destroy them had been destroyed by the truth he spent 12 years trying to suppress. But this story was never really about Marcus Blackwell. The day after the verdict, Elena was charting at the 4th floor nurses' station when Grace sat down beside her. Grace had a cup of coffee in each hand. She set one in front of Elena. Guilty, Grace said. All 3 counts. Elena picked up the coffee. I heard. How do you feel? Elena thought about it. I feel like it's a start. Grace looked at her. A start? The man's been convicted. He's lost everything. He's been convicted of 3 counts. He hit 14 people that we know of. The verdict is important. But it doesn't fix what happened to Danielle. It doesn't give David back the patient who died. It doesn't undo 8 years of fear in this building. Grace was quiet for a moment. No, it doesn't. So what does? We do, every day, by making this place what it should have been all along. Grace sipped her coffee. She nodded slowly. The new CEO starts next week, Dr. Rebecca Townsend. You've heard of her? I've heard good things. She wants to meet with you, specifically. Elena raised an eyebrow. Me? You're kind of famous around here, Elena, the nurse who took down Marcus Blackwell. I'm a nurse who defended her patient, that's all. Grace smiled. That's not all, and you know it. Dr. Rebecca Townsend arrived at Crestwood on a Monday. She was 54 years old, a physician administrator who'd spent the last decade building a reputation for collaborative leadership and institutional reform. She'd been recruited specifically because of the crisis. The board wanted someone who could rebuild trust with a staff that had been traumatized for years. Her first meeting was with Elena. They sat across from each other in the conference room that had once been Marcus's private meeting space. Rebecca had requested that the room be repurposed for staff use. The nameplate on the door had already been removed. I've read your file, Rebecca said. I've read the investigation report. I've read the incident statements from the ER. And I've talked to about 30 people in this building over the past week. Every single one of them mentions your name. I was just doing my job. You were doing a lot more than your job, and we both know it. Elena, I'm not here to put a bandage on this hospital. I'm here to rebuild it from the foundation. And I need people who understand what went wrong and how to make sure it never happens again. What are you asking? I'm asking you to join a workplace safety committee that I'm forming. I want you to help design new reporting systems, new training programs, new accountability structures. I want your input on policy. I want your perspective on culture. And I want you to help me create an environment where what happened under Marcus Blackwell is genuinely impossible. Elena was quiet for a long time. She looked at the table. She thought about her mother. She thought about Karen Mitchell, the nurse from this hospital who'd shared a room with Maria and told her stories about what it was like to work here. She thought about the promise she'd made. I'll do it, Elena said, but I have conditions. Rebecca leaned forward. Name them. The reporting system has to be independent, not HR, not administration, an outside entity that staff can contact without going through anyone who has a reason to protect the institution over the individual. Agreed. Training can't be optional. Every employee from housekeeping to the C-suite goes through it. No exceptions, no excuses. Agreed. And accountability has to be real. If someone in a position of power abuses that power, the consequence has to be immediate and public. Not a quiet transfer, not a settlement with a gag order. Visible, meaningful consequences that tell every person in this building that the rules apply to everyone equally. Rebecca nodded. Those aren't conditions, Elena. Those are exactly what I came here to implement. Elena extended her hand. Rebecca shook it. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took months. It took hundreds of meetings, dozens of policy rewrites, and more difficult conversations than anyone could count. But it happened. Elena helped design a training program that went beyond policies and procedures. It taught behavior. It taught recognition of abuse patterns. It taught staff how to intervene, how to report, how to support colleagues who were being targeted. She brought in experts from military organizations that had dealt with similar cultural problems. She adapted techniques from her Marine Corps training, not the physical ones, but the leadership ones. How to build teams where people look out for each other. How to create environments where speaking up is rewarded, not punished. How to develop leaders who earn respect through competence and compassion, rather than demanding it through fear. The results were measurable within 6 months. Patient satisfaction scores rose by 31%. Medical errors decreased by 22%. The nursing turnover rate which had been the worst in the region under Marcus, dropped to the lowest in the state. For the first time in years, Crestwood had a wait list of nurses who wanted to work there. Elena was promoted to nurse manager 4 months after Marcus's termination. A year later, she became director of nursing education. She was good at it, not because of what happened in the ER, because of who she was. She led by example. She treated every person with respect. She listened before she spoke. She created safety for people who'd forgotten what safety felt like. One afternoon, Elena was training a group of new nurses when one of them, a young woman named Jessica, who just graduated from nursing school, raised her hand and asked, "Is it true that you took down the old CEO?" The room went quiet. Elena looked at Jessica. "I stopped someone from hurting me and my patient. That's what happened." "But how did you know you could? Weren't you scared?" Elena set down her marker. She thought about the question, really thought about it. "I was scared every day I served in the Marines. I was scared on my first deployment when mortars were landing 100 yards from the medical tent. I was scared when I held a 19-year-old kid who was bleeding out and there was nothing I could do." Fear doesn't go away. You just learn that some things matter more than being afraid. Jessica nodded slowly. What matters more? The person standing next to you, the patient in your care, the colleague who needs someone to speak up. Those things matter more, every single time. The room was silent. 22 new nurses looked at Elena Vasquez and understood something that no textbook could teach them. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is the decision that someone else's safety matters more than your own comfort. National nursing organizations began reaching out. Elena was invited to speak at conferences in Atlanta, Chicago, Houston, New York. She told the same story every time, not the dramatic version, not the part where Marcus hit the floor, but the harder story. The story of a hospital where good people stayed silent because the system punished them for speaking up. The story of what happens when institutions prioritize profit over people. The story of how one voice can break a silence that everyone thought was permanent. Former Crestwood nurses began returning. Some had been gone for years. They'd left nursing entirely, driven out by Marcus's cruelty. They came back because they heard that Crestwood had changed, that it was safe now, that it was what a hospital was supposed to be. Karen Mitchell was one of them, the nurse who'd shared a hospital room with Elena's mother 3 years ago. The woman whose stories had set everything in motion. Karen applied for a position at Crestwood 18 months after Marcus's conviction. Elena was the one who interviewed her. Karen sat across from Elena in the same conference room where Elena had met Dr. Townsend. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red. She'd clearly been crying before she arrived. "I know who you are," Karen said. "You're Maria's daughter." Elena nodded. "I am. Your mother was the kindest person I ever met. She was dying, and she spent her last weeks listening to me cry about my problems. She held my hand and told me that someday someone would fix what was broken at this hospital." Karen's voice broke. She said she knew the right person. Elena reached across the table and took Karen's hand the same way she'd taken Catherine Hargrove's hand in the ER. The same way she'd taken Walter's hand on the medical floor. The same way her mother had taken Karen's hand in that hospital room 3 years ago. "Welcome home, Karen," Elena said. Karen started crying. Not the desperate, broken tears of a woman destroyed by abuse. The tears of someone who'd been lost and finally found their way back. 2 years after Marcus Blackwell's termination, Elena Vasquez was named Chief Nursing Officer of Crestwood Regional Medical Center. She was the youngest person to ever hold the position. She was also the most qualified. Crestwood received national recognition for its cultural transformation. Healthcare journals published case studies. Other hospitals sent administrators to study what Crestwood had done and how. The model Elena helped build, independent reporting, mandatory training, visible accountability, was adopted by institutions across the country. Grace retired the year Elena became CNO. On her last day, she found Elena in the break room, where she'd once warned her to keep her head down. Grace stood in the doorway and looked at the woman who'd walked into Crestwood 14 months ago with a canvas bag and a quiet smile. "I told you to stay invisible," Grace said. Elena looked up from her coffee. "I remember. I told you to keep your head down and survive. Worst advice I ever gave anyone." Elena smiled. "It wasn't bad advice, Grace. It was the only advice you had." Grace crossed the room and hugged Elena. She held on for a long time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for all of it. Thank yourself. You walked back into this building on a Friday night to give a statement. You were the first one through the door. That took more courage than anything I did." Grace pulled back and wiped her eyes. "That's not true, and you know it." "It's absolutely true. I had training. I had preparation. You had nothing but the decision to stop being silent. That's harder." Grace looked at Elena for a long time. Then she laughed. A real laugh. The kind of laugh that Crestwood hadn't heard for years before Elena arrived. "You're impossible, you know that?" "So I've been told." Grace walked out of Crestwood Regional Medical Center for the last time that afternoon. She paused at the front entrance, the same entrance she'd walked through thousands of times over the past 9 years. She looked back at the building. It looked the same: glass and steel, the Crestwood sign, the parking lot, the ambulance bay. But it felt different. It had felt different for a long time now. That evening, Elena worked a clinical shift on the 4th floor. She still did that. Once a month, she put aside the administrative responsibilities, the meetings, the policy reviews, the conference calls, and she put on scrubs and worked bedside. She checked vitals. She administered medications. She held hands. She talked to frightened patients in that gentle voice that had never changed, not once, no matter what she'd been through. At 9:15, she checked on Walter Harrison's old room. A new patient was there now, an 80-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery. Elena introduced herself, checked the woman's pain level, adjusted her pillows, and made sure she had water within reach. The woman looked at her. "You seem different from the other nurses." Elena smiled. "Different how?" "I don't know. You seem like you actually want to be here." Elena looked at the woman. She thought about Danielle Porter, selling real estate in Raleigh, flinching when doors slammed. She thought about Priya on the witness stand, hands shaking, finding her voice after 4 years of silence. She thought about David, who still worked at Crestwood and had started mentoring new nurses again. She thought about Karen Mitchell, back in scrubs, back at the bedside, back where she belonged. She thought about her mother, Maria Vasquez, who fought every day of her life, who raised a daughter alone, who made her promise, with her last breath, to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. "I do want to be here," Elena said. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." She squeezed the woman's hand, turned off the overhead light, and stepped into the hallway. The 4th floor was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from peace, not fear. Nurses moved through the corridor with their heads up, talking to each other, laughing, stopping to check on patients without glancing over their shoulders. A young doctor asked a senior nurse a question, and the nurse answered without hesitation, without worrying that someone powerful might overhear and punish her for having an opinion. Elena walked past the nurse's station. She walked past the break room where Grace had warned her, past the supply closet where Miguel had told her about David, past the medication room where Marcus had once grabbed Grace's arm hard enough to leave bruises. She stopped at the window at the end of the hall. The city stretched out below, lights flickering in the dark, and Elena Vasquez stood there in her scrubs, with her mother's photograph in her pocket, and the sound of a functioning, healthy, healed hospital humming around her. Marcus Blackwell had built a kingdom on fear. It took 5 years to build and 1.8 seconds to bring down. But the rebuilding, the real work, the thing that actually mattered, that took every day after, and it was worth every single one. Elena turned from the window and walked back toward her patients. Her shoes were quiet on the linoleum. Her pace was steady. Her hands were ready. She had promises to keep.